Thank you for the introduction. My name is Dan Harris. I'm forward planning manager at the Cairngorms National Park. So my responsibilities usually relate to making local development plans and doing research and things like that. However, one of my roles is service improvement. And one of our service improvement priorities is to engage young people in the planning process. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to speak a little bit about the project that we've been running this year, although it did actually get conceived sort of quite early on in the kind of lockdown process of last year, but it's just took a bit of time to get up and running, essentially. So basically, as I was saying, we do have this service priority to engage young people in the planning system, because planning is essentially, it's big, it's complicated, it affects everyone, and it particularly affects young people. But also, and I think I have to acknowledge this myself as someone who spends an awful lot of my time writing and getting involved in policy itself isn't very engaging. So finding ways to engage young people, or indeed any people, has always been a bit of a challenge. And while we have also, we've got tried and tested means of doing it face-to-face with, workshops and group meetings and stuff like that, when it came to the lockdown, we had to rethink the way we did things. And what we didn't want to do was essentially, and I'm aware of the irony of this, is to give lots of PowerPoint presentations to the young people, because we didn't think that would particularly work as an engaging tool, especially after they've spent their all day already through their schoolwork or their university works staring at a screen. So what we were looking for was something that would essentially kind of fit outside that more formal form of engagement and be something a bit more innovative and exciting. So the project really came out of that need to find something that would work online, wouldn't need us to be in the same room as the kids, but also wouldn't, bore the hell out of them. So we chose Minecraft. And why Minecraft? Well, it's partly because I enjoy it myself. I know how it works, and I've got lots of nephews and nieces who use it as well. So already I'm aware that obviously this is a very popular game. And I was also, while doing research, did come across the block by block UN scheme that Ia was talking about earlier. And that did indeed provide some inspiration for this project. So I always when I do these presentations, I always assume a kind of level of zero knowledge with my audience, which is probably very unfair, because I'm sure that many of you will be already aware of what Minecraft is. But just in case you're not, I do have a few slides that quickly explain it. So Minecraft is essentially, it's an open world game, and it promotes creativity, collaboration, and problem solving. In terms of the gameplay itself, there are various types, but at its core, Minecraft focuses on allowing players to basically explore and interact with a world, which is made of these kind of cubic meter-sized blocks. And in addition to those blocks and environmental features, there are other things that go on, like plants and things grow, mobs, which are essentially kind of like the non-player entities, so animals and monsters in this context, and resources that can be crafted. So what it does, it creates this kind of almost fully functioning natural world in which a player is thrown into and must either modify or work to try and survive in. So to put it simply, Minecraft offers a transformative community participation tool for public space design, which has been approved to help promote improved civic engagement. And that there is the quote from the UN project that, as I say, he was talking about earlier. So bearing this in mind, we thought actually, so if we were going to use Minecraft to run a project around the national park to engage young people in that kind of planning system and the work we do, not just as a planning authority, but also as kind of the access authority and the authority that's responsible for basically taking into consideration or ensuring that other organisations take into consideration the special qualities of the area. So to do that, what better way than to create a Minecraft map of the national park itself? Now, this is kind of revealing a bit about myself. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to maps. Part of my job as a planner of course, means working with spatial data and creating maps, but I also have a kind of little side hustle in which I like to be a bit more creative. So I actually did all this work to create the Minecraft map in my own time. As a manager of a small team who have other statutory duties, my employers were not willing to give me, several months to go about and create this. So this was something that I kind of had to do and justify myself, and also had to explore, because I have never done it before, ways in which it can be done effectively and cheaply. So the map is entirely made using open source data, which is available for Mordant Survey and Scottish Forestry, and it's also made using open source tools. And so be able to create a pretty well reflected map of the national park at a reasonable scale, which has basically, it is not one-to-one, because there are limits to how you could do that within the Minecraft program, but creating a slightly smaller version, which is essentially based on the day-night cycle and the kind of distance a player can travel over a day, means you can actually get it to a pretty realistic scale, which enable all the features to be recognizable while still maintaining it at a manageable level. Because again, if it's too big, then people aren't going to explore it properly. So in terms of the practicalities of working with a map like this, basically we used a version of Minecraft called Bedrock, because that is a cross-platform version of the game, which means that the kids could essentially choose how they accessed it. So they could do it on a computer, a PlayStation, a phone, an iPad, whatever. Basically, the idea was to make it as easy as possible for them. And we also used a Realm server. And what a Realm server is essentially it's a small server which can accommodate up to 12 different people. And for our project, we had sort of 8 kids using it regularly. So we didn't have to opt for a more expensive server. And it can essentially be accessed by those kids at any time. So the idea was that it could be fit around their schoolwork and other extracurricular activities. We essentially didn't want to put too much pressure on them at any particular point, because we didn't want it to become basically an onerous task. And we also basically ran it over the period of just over 2 months, which allowed them plenty of time to get involved. So obviously, if there are weeks where they had examinations or deadlines, which did occur during the period, they'd be able to drop off that for a period and just concentrate on what they needed to do. And then we also had forms of communication outside the game. So we used Basecamp, which has like message boards and allows us to upload documents and instructions and things like that for the kids to use. And as a way of sharing like information that stayed there permanently. And we also used a Discord server to bang out quick messages. And what that also allowed the kids to do was to have voice chat within the game, because Minecraft doesn't support that on its own. So again, that was another really easy way to help us and help the kids work together. So how the engagement worked. We basically got members of the Cairngorms Youth Action team to take part. We asked them to volunteer. And the Cairngorms Youth Action Team is something we've been running for a while. They've done a lot of work with us in terms of like providing information and setting policy. For example, they wrote a manifesto a few years ago, but we basically got 8 of them, ages 13 to 21, to volunteer for this project. And their mission was to collaboratively create a community that was based on the sort of place they wanted to live. And so the idea was that this brought all sorts of ideas about how you manage resources, how you create a place, what a nice place should be, and try to get them to put it into practice. We also set out some rules. So they had to build their settlement along the lines of the 4 aims of the national park. And I won't go into those in detail, they're set out in the legislation, but that's essentially the important ones in the context of this project were to conserve and enhance the natural environment, and to promote sustainable development, and to promote the sustainable use of natural resources, because that's all the kind of things that the game takes into account. We also set a couple of other rules, which were that they shouldn't basically run around and mock and kill each other. We didn't want it going kind of all Lord of the Flies. And we, if some simple rules about, basically not vandalizing people's things. And so we didn't really know how it was all going to work. We did wonder if people were just going to go nuts, but they did work together all very well. And so the settlement they started to build started to take place pretty quickly. Now, there are various ways we could have run this, but we decided to give the kids as much kind of discretion as they wanted to have in the way that the project was set up. So they basically played the game in survival mode. And we wanted to do that anyway, because what that means is that you don't basically have to go out and find the materials to build a settlement with, which brings in that aspect of, the sustainable management of resources, and also trying to ensure that that extraction of resources doesn't have like a particular negative effect on the environment. So it means they had to think about all those things. They also wanted to keep the monsters in, because apparently the monsters drop particular types of resources, but equally we could have taken them out, and I think it would work just fine. One of the reasons that they decided to leave them in, of course, is because it actually makes the game a bit more of an interesting place, and it has a level of risk that can come together. Having said that, what that also does is that some of the design decisions, and I'll show you these a bit later on, made by the kids, largely related to keeping monsters out of their settlement. So, for example, you can see a wooden wall around the farm there. That is to create that, stop zombies getting in and eating the children while they're farming and extracting resources. So, as I said, this was run over a couple of months. What we also did over that period was hold regular catch-up sessions with them. And in this, we were basically asking them to reflect on what they've done, asking them whether or not they thought they had successfully followed the national park aims. And that might not just be themselves. It might be, do they think other people have followed them correctly, or to an interpretation that we understood? And on the basis of what they were telling us, we then asked them to do things like create brand new policies to follow, or to create land allocations with site requirements as a means of kind of managing the growing development of that settlement as it grew and became more complicated. So the first thing that we found out was that this castle, which was built by a particular person above kind of where Aviemore was going to be, was not favourably seen by other members of the group, who did not feel that it sat in very well with the national park's aims. It wasn't pulled down in the end, but what it did lead on to was to the creation of two policies. So the kids basically wrote these as a kind of reaction to that particular castle, so that in the future, where developments came together, they needed to be able to kind of meet these two requirements. What they felt was that in terms of the aims, that they were too broad to be interpreted in a way that was useful to them. And that's quite right, because we don't just interpret things according to the aims, we have to have planning policies that sit underneath them. So we always knew that was going to be something that happened, and we kind of designed it so we could have this conversation about policy writing in an organic way. And that worked out really well, because they came up with these two policies. They also were set a task of, again, as a means of managing it, to set out allocated land, which they did do. And they also set out site requirements for those particular plots of land, because you can add signs in Minecraft with instructions and information written on them. So they did that. They set out plots of land. They put in signs which basically said, this has to be a kind of like a dwelling. It cannot be over so many blocks high, and it must have an element of green space attached to it. So, like, very much principles that we do consider as planners and as placemakers. So again, that was another interesting exercise that not only brought them into what we do as planners, but also made them and gave them the role of a developer as well, who had to follow those rules. And so again, they're thinking about how that process works, and how some of the conflicts and issues that arise from that process might be dealt with. And that's where we come into enforcement. Now, enforcement is quite an important side of planning. It's how we make sure people do what they said they were going to do, or we formalise things that they've done that they shouldn't have done. And in this instance, the kids basically came up with a means of creating an enforcement regime, where if something was in breach of the allocations or the policies that they'd set out, they would essentially form a committee to deal with that. And that could be either demolition or mitigation to make that thing better. And in the end, they actually did have someone demolish a tower that they were building and reuse the material within an allocated site that is set out to create something that was more in line with what they felt met the policies and the aims of the national park. The offender, as it were, was also issued some community service which is not something we do in real life as planners, but when we presented this to our planning committee, they were quite keen on it. But basically, the offender had to do a community service where they had to go and spend a couple of hours gathering resources for the other members. So it kind of worked in that Minecraft context. Some of the other really interesting things that came out is the way that the kids basically collaborated with each other. So they never kind of went away and did anything that was particularly individualistic or would only benefit them, or end up kind of repeating something that someone else did. So they set up, one of the first things they did was set up a collaborative farm with these kind of rules. They also had like a community sort of composting area. They had a community board which set out instructions, kind of like what infrastructure projects they wanted to do. Like, for example, build a bridge over the river, or create some bushes that would be basically a block to monsters and things like that. And they also, and again, it was something that we asked them to do, was considered the public realm as part of the development, and created this. Well, they began creating a stone circle quite early on as a central sort of hub to the village, because kind of having that communal space was important. And what they ended up doing was creating a nether portal, which, if you're not familiar with Minecraft, is essentially a portal to the underworld, in which could be accessed from the public space, which is a nice little addition to the town. And so in the end, this is kind of what the this is, I think, halfway through the screenshot shot from halfway through the project. So this was before they started setting out allocations. So this kind of then shows you how that development started to take place, with the interaction between those different buildings and how they sit within the landscape. So broadly speaking, they kind of felt that this more or less fit in with the national park's aims, although they could argue that perhaps some parts were a bit suspect. And I suppose when we originally thought of this idea to come up with a project, we originally kind of hoped that they would be able to follow the national park's aims quite successfully. But the fact that they didn't, and the fact that they had trouble with it, was actually even more beneficial, because it meant that we could have those conversations around what you do about it, and how people interpret different things, and how conflict can arise, which obviously all have real life parallels. So in terms of, this is to kind of wrap up. So in terms of kind of the overall outcomes, while we weren't sure what we would get out of it initially, we did want the exercise to be aimed at this group and to help them think about that relationship between the national park's landscape, its environment, development, and land use, because that's exactly what we have to do as an authority. It also introduced them to, how the planning policy is made and implemented. It also introduced them to the challenges of interpreting that policy, and it also had them come into conflict with one another, just as we have in real life. So it really kicked off really nicely all those kind of themes and things that we do as planners. And in the end, we had them basically present to our planning committee about their findings, and we had them feed back about the process. And what I can say is that they were very enthusiastic about this, and actually wished they were able to spend more time on it. And they did say that it was a considerably better process than having that kind of PowerPoint heavy presentation. And because we were able to spread it over a period of time and months, it meant they were able to then not only just take part in the process fully, but also have time to think about and consider the decisions they'd made and the decisions that other people had made too. And finally, I guess it's worth saying that it did overcome that kind of issue of lockdown and enable us to set out a project that could be done remotely. And based on what we've done with the youth team, we've kind of been thinking about ways of how we might develop this project and expand it and make it useful for other organisations such as youth groups or schools to take it on and use it themselves. So the map that we have here is now available on our website to download, so anybody can access that, any organisation can access that. and we really look forward to people doing that and seeing what they come up with. But what we want to do then is also have something a little bit more formal. So we're kind of working on that at the moment, which, as I say, almost like a curriculum that could be taken up by other groups to use in the context of us as a national park authority, as a planning authority, or whatever, and using that as a means to kind of engage in landscape in an easy and interesting way.